Question. Hi, my question is, what happens to a fallen being's I am presence if the fallen being degrades through the spheres? Let's say it falls from the 4th sphere to the 5th, to the 6th, then to the 7th. And then it gets erased in the ritual of the second death. In order to understand this, you have to have watched my video about how the world was created, because it explains the different spheres and the process of some beings can fall. So if this is completely new to you, you need to watch that video or you'll get nothing out of this answer. So is the I am presence then, if the I am presence is then anchored high above in the 4th sphere or one of the other higher spheres, also take into account that even the ascended masters working with earth, those in the 6th sphere, even they are far below in comparison to that being's I am presence. And yet another related question, please. How can we come to identify ourselves as one of those fallen beings who went through the ritual of the second death? Is the power of the I am presence larger than that of the average person? Thank you for your comment. Okay, so I'm assuming you know what fallen beings are and what the I am presence is and the idea of different spheres. So the question is, you have let me just give a short summary here. The essence of your being is your higher self, which is called the I am presence. It resides in the spiritual realm. And the I am presence is a very complex individual being. It has a very complex individuality, far more than your outer personality, even though the outer personality can also be very complex. But the I am presence is more complex. So your I am presence is unique. There's billions and billions of I am presences in the world, but there's none of them that are exactly like yours. So it's a very elaborate work for the beings who create an I am presence. And in order to avoid that it can become lost or damaged, it's anchored in the spiritual realm, right? But in order to grow, the I am presence can choose to send an extension of itself into embodiment, for example, on a planet like Earth. And that's what I call the conscious you. So the conscious you can then, over many lifetimes, build this very elaborate separate self, separate outer personality. And it can basically go into what I call duality and separation, where it's seeking to elevate that separate self to some ultimate status. And it starts out in a particular sphere, and when the sphere is ready to ascend, because most of the other beings in that sphere have either ascended or are ready to ascend, if that conscious you isn't willing to ascend with the sphere and give up the separate self in order to do so, it can fall into the next sphere. And that is why it can eventually come to a point where either the conscious you itself decides that it doesn't want to go on, because it doesn't want to walk the path up and retrace its steps, the steps it took down in consciousness. So the conscious you can decide it wants to go through the second death. Or the I am presence can decide that the conscious you has had long enough to change and turn around, and it doesn't want to be tied to this conscious you anymore, so it is allowing the conscious you to go through the second death. Right? So that's the first question. The question is the I am presence then anchored high above in the 4th sphere if the conscious you fell in the 4th sphere? And it's my understanding that that's not the case. If a conscious you falls, then the I am presence descends with a conscious you, so that it's now in the spiritual realm right above the next sphere. So we are in the 7th sphere. So an I am presence of a fallen being that fell in the 4th sphere is no longer in the 4th sphere, it's in the 6th sphere, which is the sphere that ascended before ours, and therefore forms what we call the spiritual realm that's right above ours. The spiritual realm, of course, goes all the way up to the Creator, has different levels, the different spheres, but nevertheless, the level right above us is the previously ascended sphere, the 6th, And that's where the I Am Presence of a fallen being is. But you have to realize here, the I Am Presence of a fallen being is not ascended. It's not an ascended master. And that's why, take into account that even the ascended masters working with earth, those in the sixth sphere, even they are far below in comparison to that being's I Am Presence. And that's what I'm saying. That's not correct. That's not a right assumption. They are above the I Am Presence of a fallen being because the I Am Presence of a fallen being hasn't ascended, and they have. Right? And then it says, how can we come to identify ourselves as one of those fallen beings who went through the ritual of the second death? Well, how can we identify ourselves as anything? What can identify ourselves as something is the conscious you. Right? The conscious you of a fallen being can come to realize it's a fallen being, that it has fallen through one or several spheres. And that it has the potential to turn around, but in order to ascend, it has to retrace its steps and walk all those steps up that it took down previously. The conscious you can come to that realization. And if the conscious you is willing to walk that path, then it will receive all possible help from the ascended masters to walk that path as quickly as possible. If the conscious you decides it will not walk that path, then the being goes through the second death. That means the outer personality, all of the energy misqualified by that outer personality is dissolved. They call it the lake of sacred fire. And it just means that it isn't as epically dramatic as it sounds. It just means that all the misqualified energy that has a fear-based vibration is raised to a love-based vibration. So it's basically neutralized. That means there's no energetic trace of that fallen being anywhere. But then what happens to the conscious you? Well, the conscious you merges back into the I Am Presence and is no more. The I Am Presence can be aware, and is still aware, that it sent an extension of itself, a conscious you, that became a fallen being. But the conscious you isn't aware of this. After you go through the second death, you are not aware of anything. The conscious you merges back into your I Am Presence, it's erased, whatever you want to call it. But there is no awareness of what happened before. The conscious you has no awareness whatsoever. It's essentially parallel to what some of these non-dual teachers are saying, that the separate self is unreal, and when you awaken or are enlightened, the separate self ceases to exist. But if that was the case, there would be no awareness of it. Some will say the ultimate reality is infinite awareness, and when you awaken, yourself, which can only be a separate self, goes back into infinite awareness. But see, that's not an experience you can have. You can't have the experience that I, as a being that has awareness, am now merged back with infinite awareness, because in infinite awareness, all sense of I is erased. And that's what happens to the conscious you in the second death. So then, is the power of the I Am Presence larger than that of the average person? Well, I'm not sure what the person means with power. I mean, the awareness of the I Am Presence is larger, much larger than the average person, right? Because here's how you have to look at this. Let's say the conscious you is comparable to a person who has put on a diving suit. You had these old-fashioned diving suits, this big rubber suit with a big helmet made out of bronze, and there was just a little hole it could see through. So that's the conscious you who goes into this diving suit. And now it jumps into the water and it's weighted down so it goes down to the bottom. So first of all, it has only a little hole it can look through. Second of all, the water is unclear, so it only has a limited distance it can see. And so the awareness of the conscious you, and therefore the power, the ability, is very limited. But let's now say that instead of a person going into a diving suit, we have one of these remote-operated vehicles, like a robot that's connected to a cable up top. And The robot has a camera, but again, it can only see a certain field of view and the water is still unclear. But up on the surface, there's a person who is operating the vehicle, and that person can of course see the whole horizon around. However, it can't see what's going on under the water. But the I Am Presence can. So in other words, the I Am Presence has a double field, a double vision, in the sense that it can look at the world through the outer personality, the perceptions filter, the field of view, the camera of the conscious you. But it can also look at the world from above. It doesn't mean that the I Am Presence has the same perspective on the world as an Ascended Master, because an Ascended Master has a wider perspective and has greater powers because it has ascended. But it has a much greater view and awareness than the average person, yes, and in fact than any person that's in embodiment. So I know these are very subtle questions, but I hope this clears up some of the confusion.